Right, so the midterm is probably the first thing we should talk about today because it's Wednesday, it's this week. We haven't really talked a lot about it, so if you have any questions, now is an excellent time. So it's on the 26th, it's a 1 hour midterm from 10, we'll start at 10:10 sharp and go until 11:10. That should be enough time. And it's not here, it is not in this room, it's at the exam center at 225 McCall in EX100. I made a mistake on the original version of the slides I uploaded to Blackboard. It said EX110. I strongly recommend you don't try to go to EX110 because it does not exist. So that would be a very upsetting and futile endeavor for you. So EX100, and that's mainly so that we're not in a room where like everybody's side by side and you can see over the person's shoulder in front of you and so on and so forth. It's a much more spread out. There's nice big desks. So it's a much nicer place to write an exam for a variety of reasons. So go there. You should bring a pen and or pencil and your student ID, and no other aids are allowed. So no notes, nothing like that. Right? So the structure of the midterm, there will be 20 multiple choice questions worth 1 point each. So that is 1 point for the correct answer, 0 points for the incorrect answer. So there's no like negative points for getting the wrong answer. Those multiple choice questions are about I would say 90% from the lectures. So if you've been coming to the lectures, if you've been studying from the slides, you'll be able to get, and furthermore you have perfect recall of it all, you'll be able to get 90% of those. 10%, I think maybe 10 or 15% are from both, or are from only the readings. So 10 to 15% of those multiple choice questions will ask you about things that I did not mention in lecture that are only talked about in the readings. All right, so if you see something that you've never heard of before and you didn't do any of the readings, that might be why. I will once again remind you that it's only the required readings that I'm drawing those questions for. There's a bunch of optional readings on the Blackboard. They are genuinely optional and I will not ask you questions about them. Okay, so, and the nature of those multiple choice questions are mostly of the form, so-and-so said blank, and you fill in the blank. So it's connecting the name of ideas with the author of the idea with the content of the idea. So it would behoove you to know the names of who came up with these ideas, because it's either the content of the question or a clue that you can use to figure out what the answer is. All right? I'm not asking for any specific dates, and I want to say that I'm not asking anything about the minor issues that we've talked about, but like it's 85% stuff that made it onto one of the slides. So I don't really believe in trick questions. I believe in diagnostic questions where I'm trying to diagnose whether you've been understanding the material. So hopefully that won't be, hopefully you'll experience that as fair and moderately challenging. Then there'll be 3 definitions worth 2 points each. Those are key course terms, key ideas from the course that we've discussed in lecture, and your job on those ones is just to define it, that is just to explain what the idea is. And then there'll be 1 short answer question. So the short answer question is going to be a very general question about a certain textbook that I've been going on and on about this whole semester. It's a very general question about the Grinnell reading. So if you've done the Grinnell reading and you've been thinking about it, then you're in very good shape to answer that. Okay? And you can almost guess what that question's gonna, what the text of that question is gonna be from the fact that it's a very general question about the Grinnell reading. Okay? So hopefully there won't be any big surprises on this. Historically, the last time I gave a midterm similar in structure to this, the average was quite high, almost disturbingly high. So hopefully you'll do well. And then, so that will be on Wednesday. There is no class afterwards. It's a 1 hour midterm, and then you're done for the day. We'll discuss it on the following Monday. So the drop date for this course is July 31st. And we are going to do our very best to get both the marks for the short answer, or the first written assignment and the midterm back to you by July 31st. We are required to get at least one of those back to you by July 31st. by the rules of the institution, and our goal is to get them both back. I don't want to make promises for people who are not me doing this stuff, but that's what I've asked them to do, and hopefully they're both competent and intelligent people, so hopefully there should be no problem with that. Is that all right? Yeah, question? Can I post some past tests? No, I cannot post past tests. Sorry. I've only ever taught this once before, and the past test bears considerable resemblance to the current test. So, yeah, sorry about that. I wish, if I had like a rich repertoire of past tests, I would totally do that, but I think it would just make it too easy. When I'm a more experienced academic, I will very happily do stuff like that. But. And past tests from other versions of this course wouldn't help you, basically. This course is so different from professor to professor. They teach very, very different courses. So I could give you what other professors have put up, but it wouldn't be helpful. So, any other questions about that? The midterm and or the first written assignment? Yeah. So yes, the case studies, the sort of, not just the philosophical ideas, but the case studies that we use to illustrate them are also potentially on the midterm. There are a few of them on the midterm. So all of the content of the lectures is potentially testable. And all of the lectures are potentially testable. So every single lecture, including this one, is potentially on the midterm. Okay? Okay. It should be fine. Usually this is fine. All right, so the topic today is social construction. We finally finished the Grinnell stuff, and now we're on to a different required author. So today we're going to talk about another perspective that you could have on this basic question that we've been asking about the relationship between science and values. So this is the last lecture on the values to science direction. After the midterm, we'll start on the science to values part of that loop. But what I'd like to give you today is a kind of, I consider this a kind of historical overview of things that people have said in the past about how values are related to science. I don't think all that many people currently hold or defend the views that we're going to be talking about today for reasons that I'll explain shortly. But it's useful for you to have these to understand the debates that have been going on about this stuff, I hope. And one of the goals of this lecture is to try to help you make sense of some of the things that people have said about the relationship between values and science that might otherwise strike you as absurd or like incomprehensible. Like, how could anybody say that? So, for example, we'll talk today about the social construction of math. And this has been an example that a bunch of people have raised. But like, what about math? Isn't that just purely objective? So one of the goals of today is to try to explain to you why anybody would say that it's socially constructed, and in what senses, we'll explore in what senses they could be right or they could be wrong. So that's the goal today. So is science a social construct? So if Grinnell and Longino are right about how science really works, then science is a social process. It's a deeply social process in that it doesn't work without the correct social arrangement, right? So does that mean that its results are socially constructed? And if so, what does that even mean? So what does it mean to say that something is socially constructed, and what should that make us conclude about either the legitimacy or the sort of position of science in our larger worldview? And the required reading for today is by a U of T philosopher called Ian Hacking. This is chapter 1 from his really great book, The Social Construction of What? And it was published in 1999, just after the peak of what lots of people have called the science wars. It's a very dramatic name for people publishing articles at each other, but nonetheless, that's what they called it. So the science wars was this debate that happened mostly in the 1990s, precisely on this question of the degree to which science is socially constructed and what that means for our larger worldview. So the movement that was sort of crystallizing this idea that science is a social construct, and that's an important and interesting thing to say, is often called postmodernism. It doesn't really cohere as a set of ideas, so if you ask somebody what postmodernism is and they give you a nice short answer, they're oversimplifying quite a bit. However, so it's a movement in architecture and art and literary criticism and a whole bunch of other things that get under the broad umbrella of postmodernism. But this guy Lyotard, who's one of the people who is identified as a central figure in postmodernism, puts it in the following way, which hopefully is at least somewhat helpful. It says, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. So incredulity is like not believing or not taking seriously, or skepticism towards. So skepticism towards meta-narratives. And a meta-narrative is an overarching story about how all of the little stories in life fit together. So postmodernism was this movement where people started to get really skeptical about the meta-narratives that were on offer. So a couple of examples of meta-narratives. For example, here's a big one. This was a big sort of Enlightenment meta-narrative. History is progressing towards a rational and enlightened utopia. So Hegel thought this, Marx thought this. People from sort of Enlightenment Europe, that is, I think it's sort of 1800s Europe, believed that all of history was a march of progress towards the perfected European nation state with its perfected ways of thinking and being, and that was like, all of history was aimed at basically Europe in the 1700s. So that's a meta-narrative about how all the stories that make up history come together in this big overarching story. And this is the kind of meta story that the postmodernists wanted people to like not really buy into. Here's another one. Here's a religious meta-narrative. History is a battle between good and evil that will end on Judgment Day. I think this is, so it's at least shared by Christianity and Islam, believe that sort of the arc of history can be understood as a moral battle, and that it'll have a definite end where it's all sort of sorted out. So that's another meta-narrative that the postmodernists were skeptical of. The one that we'll mostly be thinking about is the scientific one. So the meta-narrative goes, science is the one true way of seeing the world. All and only scientific knowledge is valid, so history can only be viewed in terms of pre-scientific ignorance and post-scientific knowledge. Right, so if you're going to look at history, there's just a big dividing line where science was invented, and everything before that was just kind of foolishness, and everything after that is this, well, it's connected to the March of Progress stuff, and history moves on because we finally got the right answer. It's science. So these are a variety of meta-narratives. There's a bunch of other meta-narratives that you could consider, and the postmodernists were trying to critique these. They're trying to say, these meta-narratives are not trustworthy, and we should somehow get ourselves out from under them. There's another strain in this critique that is definitely worth thinking about, definitely worth being aware of, which is the relationship between science and colonialism. So colonialism is usually when we talk about colonialism, what we mean is the last sort of 500 years or so of Western powers insinuating themselves into places all over the world and kind of taking over the joint and telling people what to do. And for much of that time, there was a really explicit story about why they were justified in doing that. This was not like implicit bias. This was not something they quietly kept to themselves. This was the loud and proud story that they told themselves about why it was okay. I mean, this is just one part of it, but essentially it went, my culture is better than yours because we have science, therefore it's okay for us to take over your land, basically. This is, by the way, this is not science, this is the manifest destiny. These are people moving west across North America. But it's the same basic, like, we have this glowing, beautiful thing that is called science that proves that my way of speaking and dressing and eating and acting is better than your way of speaking and dressing and eating and acting, and therefore we're justified in doing basically whatever we want all over the world. I hope that strikes you as a weak inference. This strikes me as an exceptionally weak inference. It's not the case that whoever's got a hold of science has automatically got a better culture in some comprehensive way. You're probably better at chemistry, sure, but that doesn't justify anybody in taking over anybody's house, right? I don't know. So very few people, I think, defend this today. You should be, if you think this, you should be embarrassed to say it in public because people will think ill of you. But So this was for hundreds of years the loud and proud story that people told themselves about why colonialism was okay. And part of what made the postmodernists worry about science as this kind of like, oh, it's just for everyone, you know, like forget about your specific local culture, just come to science, it's better, is that it kind of fits into this really poor and kind of morally egregious inference that really was part of the story of colonialism for quite a long time. Right, so this is part of what they were worried about, and the argument that they would make in the sort of 1990s was, okay, this is not part of the loud and proud story anymore, but it is a kind of subtle undercurrent that continues on in the way that science gets treated and the way that it's sort of exported and all that stuff, right? So that was part of the concern as well, right? Okay, so in the 1990s, mostly in the US, there was this debate about whether science is a social construct or a truth-generating procedure or both. And if you actually get serious about reading the people involved, almost none of them had a hard line one or the other. Like practically everybody who got published about this anyway, who got accepted and people were responding to them in the literature, had some measured position where it's somewhere between a purely objective process and a pure social construct. People accuse each other of being extreme on one side or the other all the time. So you read somebody else's work and you go, ah, you're just a relativist. And they'll say, ah, you're just a pure scientismist or whatever. So, but most people in the debate were somewhere in between, and the debate was over sort of where you should lie on this spectrum of how far is it to one side or the other. And roughly the postmodern critique of science went like this. Science claims to be objective and value neutral, but all experience is mediated through culture and language. Cultures and languages are social constructs, so science is a social construct. Okay, so other than the first premise there, I think you should accept all of these things. I think those are all reasonable inferences. So science claims to be objective and value neutral. Well, some scientists claim that, not all. Lots of scientists are perfectly on board with the idea, like Grinnell is perfectly on board with the idea that values play a role. But all experiences are mediated through culture and language. I can't tell you anything without using, I'm a monolingual English speaker, so I can't tell you anything without speaking English to you. And it's all mediated through the culture that that's embedded in. So sure, like all experience, anything that we can share is mediated through culture. And cultures and languages are social constructs. So any communication about science is a social construct. But then the question is, what does that actually mean? What does that entail that it is a social construct? And the postmodernists wanted to say something like, well, lots of them were on the side of saying, well, that means it's just kind of made up in some important sense, or that it's a political tool rather than a tool for finding out a truth that everybody should subscribe to. So this is why hacking critique will be interesting. I just want to, so a certain psychology prof at U of T has been going on at great length about postmodernism and its dangers for the young minds. And he paints it as this rising tide, like postmodernism is this thing that's just exploding on campuses. I've been on this campus for 17 years, and that's not my experience at all. Like, I don't see much evidence for postmodernism as a rising tide. So this is a Google Ngram. This is a wonderful tool that you all have access to, by the way. Ngrams tell you, of all of the books that Google has, how many times is a term used in those books. So this tells you like how many occurrences of a given term are there in the set of all books from that period, right? So this is the uses of postmodernism in books, and you can see it peaks around 95. Around 1995, people were really, really hot on the idea of postmodernism. They talked about it a lot. It was around the middle of the so-called science wars. And then it kind of tapers off. Like, I don't know anybody who's really hot on postmodernism as an issue that they need to deal with. It could be the department I'm in. The Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology doesn't really do that stuff very much. We like facts. So it does not strike me that this is a rising tide. This strikes me as a passing fad, to be honest. So this lecture is mostly about what was going on in the 90s, frankly. Here's Google Trends for postmodernism. That was only up till 2008. But here's Google Trends for another amazing tool. This tells you how often a term is used. I think it's how often it's searched for on Google, which is a different question than how often it's used on the web, but still a metric for how much space an idea is taking up in the culture. And you can see this is from 2004 to the present. And it's also not, there's no big spike here. If you're wondering what that kind of semi-regular pulse is, the peaks are around the time students will be writing essays, and the valleys are the summer. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about who's asking about postmodernism and why. Mostly it looks to me like it's people having to write essays about it. You will possibly constitute part of the next spike in this as you're researching for your final essays. But again, the point here is just that I see no evidence for this viewpoint as a rising, something that's sweeping across the campuses and driving the students mad with relativism. To me, this looks like, I think this lecture is mostly about what was going on in the discussion in the 90s, but it's nonetheless hopefully good historical stuff for you. Just for comparison, here's the curve of social construction. This is back to the engrams. Social construction also hits a peak around 95 and begins to taper. Postmodernism, you can see, is a much smaller curve, so people talk more about social construction than postmodernism. And here's set theory, just for a reference. So I take it that set theory is something that most people don't usually, like, you don't, any given day, you don't Google set theory, but it's just there for kind of like comparison purposes of the scale of these ideas. So more people search for social construction than set theory, but more people search for set theory than postmodernism. Okay? So that's just to sort of give you the historical shape of when this discussion was at its peak and where it's been going ever since. I take it that, like, if you're looking to go to grad school to talk about postmodernism, you should switch up your jargon because it's not a hot term anymore. It's not something that people really talk about. Okay, so at the peak of this, 1999, or just after the peak, Hacking writes this great book, The Social Construction of What?, where he tries to tease apart meaningful senses of social construction from trivial ones. So I gave you an argument earlier that science is all socially constructed, but that argument is perfectly compatible with the idea that science is only socially constructed in totally trivial ways, in ways that don't really matter and shouldn't shake your confidence in their results at all. It's also compatible with, that argument was also compatible with much stronger senses of social construction. So what we've got are a range of possibilities, and Hacking tries to sort of carve out a variety of layers in which we could say something is socially constructed, a variety of ways which have dramatically different consequences for how we should react to the dramatic revelation that something is in fact a social construct. And he gives this really nice quote about why you should care. So fundamentally, the debate about social construction is about relativism. So the idea that there is a bunch of different viewpoints and there's nothing that decides between them. He says, let us get down to gut reactions. What are we afraid of? Plenty. There's the notion that any opinion is as good as any other. If so, won't relativism license anything at all? So this is what the people who are fighting against this postmodernism were worried about. Say, like, look, if you tell me that this stuff that we based our lives around is just a social product in the same way that, like, the rules of chess are just a social product, then doesn't that mean that anybody can do anything and there's no sense to be made of the world at all? That's the worry of extreme relativism. A lot of people are worried about radical relativism, the idea that all knowledge is just a social construct, but as far as I can tell, almost nobody actually defends such a position. You really have to, like, to get somebody on record as saying, like, I think it's all just made up, is really hard. Very few people want to say that, and lots of people get accused of it who deny it. So Thomas Kuhn, for example, gets accused of being this radical relativist, right? Because you have one paradigm with some standards of evidence, and then you shift to another paradigm with different standards of evidence. So how can you compare between paradigms? That means that you're just sort of like moving around in the dark, not actually having any kind of objective movement of science towards truth or something like that. Kuhn denies that he's a relativist. He thinks there is progress in science, but he gets accused of relativism. So this is a fairly common situation where everybody's worried about relativism. Not everybody, like lots of people are really worried about relativism, and very few people seem to defend it explicitly. But So there you have it. I have Derrida here this is Derrida for beginners. He's as a little troll man. This is how he's definitely viewed as Derrida is one of the central figures in the sort of postmodern literary criticism world, and he was viewed as a kind of troll of knowledge, trying to tear it apart from the inside. But there's not really much to be, I would argue that there's not really all that much to be worried about here. Hilary Putnam, a philosopher, an analytic philosopher, has a really nice reply to this. I think that it's worth just thinking about. So it rules out the most extreme forms of relativism in a quick and easy way. So you can't occupy the total relativism position without fear of contradiction, because radical relativism says no point of view is trustworthy, but that is itself a point of view. So if you don't believe that arguments work, then your argument for that is automatically untrustworthy, right? If you're right, then your argument isn't really an argument. Therefore, you've sawn off the branch that you're sitting on. The other version of this critique is that postmodernism is itself a kind of meta-narrative. So if you say, reject all meta-narratives, don't accept any generalizations, well, that was a generalization, wasn't it? So you've contradicted yourself. Similarly, if somebody gives you an argument that says, language cannot function because you have a different lived experience than I do, so because the meaning is dependent on lived experience, we can't actually share anything about our experiences, right? So you just have your world and I have my world, and there can be no contact between them. Well, you don't have to listen to that person, do you? Because if they're right, then they're just making noises at you, right? If they're correct that language doesn't function, then you don't have to listen to them. You should only listen to people who think that you can meaningfully communicate, is the argument here. Now, there's lots of shades of this. There's lots of shades of relativism that don't fall prey to this style of critique. So if you say, for example, well, your way of speaking and your way of understanding your words might be different than mine because you have a different lived experience, but we can talk about it and we can kind of like triangulate to each other and try to get across those gaps, then you have a at least conceptually coherent point of view. Right? That's a conceptually coherent point of view that doesn't fall prey to these are called transcendental critiques from the conditions for the possibility of something. But but this, at least, I think this nicely rules out the most extreme versions of relativism that just sort of say language is impossible, knowledge is impossible, all points of view are worthless. Well, those are all things that you say and things that you're arguing for from a point of view. So you can't occupy, I would say, according to Putnam's critique, you can't occupy the most extreme versions of relativism. And really not that many people try. So don't worry about the most extreme point on this scale. Furthermore, this is The Onion always puts it perfectly, U.S. economy grinds to a halt as its nation realizes money is just a symbolic, mutually shared illusion. There's Ben Bernanke burning some money because he's like, oh, did you ever realize that money's only a thing because we all agree it's a thing? And sure, it is. Money only exists because we all agree that money exists. Anybody who thinks that that entails that money isn't important, feel free to come give me all of your money. I will happily accept it. You can prove your point that money's unimportant because it's a social construct, it's unimportant. That's fine. I'll accept bills, coins, whatever you got. But I don't think anybody should do that because money is important. It's a social construct which is nonetheless, in a powerful sense, real. So calling it a social construct is not at all to say it's not important, it's not a real fact of reality, and it is not at all to say that you can just ignore it. Right, so again, the extreme version of this is untenable, and nobody can kind of consistently occupy it. So forget about the extreme. The rest of the lecture, we're going to worry about the kind of more moderate positions, the positions in the middle that are at least coherent and that we can have a meaningful debate about. Huh? I love this headline. Okay, so Hacking tries to get at both the reasons why people have pursued social construction talk and categorize the senses in which something can be socially constructed. So he's trying to get at why did people talk this way, and what are some sensible things that they could mean? And I will try to argue that there are some sensible senses of social construction. Like calling something a social construct is not to say nothing at all if you get precise about what you mean. So here's the conditions under which something is socially constructed, according to Hacking. So this is a quote from the book. It says, the social construction of X, where X is any thing. X, so one condition is that X need not have existed or need not be at all as it is. X, or X as it is at present, is not determined by the nature of things. It is not inevitable. This is the main one, okay? So this is the main, if you're gonna call something a social construct, it should satisfy this, right? That it could have been otherwise, right? So when somebody points out that something is socially constructed, they're saying something important or interesting just in case that thing could have been otherwise. Okay? And to the degree that it could have been otherwise, it's an important and interesting thing to point out that it's a social construct. Okay? Very often they go further and urge that X is quite bad as it is, so there's some problem with X or with the way X functions in society, and even further, that we would be much better off if X were done away with or at least radically transformed. So calling something a social construct is at least saying that it could have been otherwise, and usually is saying that we should reconfigure our relationship with that thing. We should rebuild the way it's being socially constructed. Yeah? Okay, so those are the claims, and we'll see that they can make better or worse sense depending on exactly what you're saying is socially constructed. So this is my favorite example, and I don't know what your cultural background is, but for me this is beautiful. So doesn't it just seem natural and obvious to you that pink is for girls and blue is for boys? I don't know, maybe that's not like, for people who didn't grow up in North America, maybe that's like a totally unnatural thing to you, but for me, it's just completely obvious and natural and sensible that girls wear pink and boys wear blue. But that wasn't even the case 100 years ago. So for a June 1918 article from the trade publication Earnshaw's Infant Department said, the generally accepted rule is pink for the boys and blue for the girls. The reason is that pink, being a more decided and stronger color, is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and daintier, is prettier for the girl. So the idea that blue is associated with boys and pink is associated with girls is clearly something that could have been otherwise. You know that's true because it was otherwise. At least for a period, there was, before even this, all babies were dressed in white because they would soil themselves and you needed to bleach their clothes. So the standard was white for everybody. White dresses for all children was the Western standard, and then we got into this blue for girls, pink for boys phase, and now we're very much in a pink for girls, pink for boys stage. Now, I know this intellectually, I'm telling you this, but nonetheless, I have this really vivid experience that pink is for girls and blue is for boys. It's a really vivid experience of that being a natural way of categorizing the world. I don't know how to get rid of it. I've known this fact for several years now, and it's still very vivid. And my sister's got a little girl who loves pink. And I guarantee you that she's not the type of mother that enforced that on her children. She wasn't like, pink is for girls, blue is for boys, don't wear that, wear this. She just wouldn't have done that. And nonetheless, her little girl is wild for pink things and doesn't really care that much for blue. So it looks like it's reproducing itself as just a natural fact about children that they have these proclivities, but it's clearly a social construct that could have been otherwise. Now this is I don't know, you might think that this is I don't really see what the problem is with having this categorization. Like, I don't think the specific colors involved are doing a great deal of damage to like if you put a little girl in a pink hat, I don't think you're damaging her in any deep way, as far as I can tell. I mean, I would suggest there's much more serious things that we should be worried about than that. So it maybe doesn't satisfy Hacking's number 2 and 3, that it's very bad as it is and we should spend a lot of energy changing it. But it certainly satisfies as number 1, doesn't it? That it could have been otherwise. So this is a thing that's a contingent social product. Okay. Now, here's another thing that's often said to be, so here's a thing that I'm not sure that it could have been otherwise in any important sense. So these are both versions of what we call the Pythagorean theorem. This one's written in ancient Chinese from about 1000 BCE. This one is in an ancient Babylonian tablet from even earlier. and they all get the same results. Like, nobody's calculating this differently. Like, if you use this clay tablet and you use this, I guess it would have been written on bamboo strips at the time, and you use them to calculate, you get the same answer. And you get the same answer as the Greek Pythagorean theorem. Right? And these are produced, as far as anybody can tell, independently. Right? So this does not appear to me to be a thing that could have been otherwise. And so it fails Hacking's number one. Right? At least the pure formal structure doesn't look like it could have been otherwise in any meaningful sense. The words you use to express it clearly could have been. Like, this is not ancient Greek, and this is not ancient Greek. So the words that you use can be different. Furthermore, the cultural associations can be different. So, for example, the ancient Babylonians had a very vivid religious experience of math. For them, math and their religious lives were deeply, deeply connected. This is something that the Pythagoreans and the Greeks picked up from them, the Egyptians as well. So a whole bunch of cultures had this, like, math is the keys to the universe, and it connects us to the heavens and God and all that stuff. Whereas the ancient Chinese, generally speaking, are famous for not really having all that much of a spiritual attitude. This is more a practical thing. So if you need to know the area of something or the length of a line, this is an extremely important practical technique. It's not that they didn't care about it, it's just that they had a radically different conception of why it matters. Right? So the formal stuff is something that, as far as I can tell, could not have been different. So if you've been refraining from using the Pythagorean theorem because it's a Western construct, I have good news. You can use it with confidence, knowing that it's not at all something that's sort of like intrinsically tied to Western culture. It's a shared cultural product of many different, so for every like culture for which we have a written record, they have basically one of these. And it looks like we all came up with it independently. Now, what I want to warn you about is the inference from that to the idea that anything that happens in a math class is culturally neutral. Okay, so if you say math is not a social construct, can you infer from that that nothing that happens in a math class is culturally loaded or value loaded? I don't think so. I think you have to be very precise about what you're saying is or is not a social construct. So here's some questions from Tanzanian colonial textbooks. So these in the period where the British had come, colonized Tanzania, and these are the questions that they would give to young Tanzanian school children. If a cricketer scores altogether R runs in X innings, N times not out, his average is R over X minus N, find his average. Or reduce this number of farthings, this number of halfpence, this number of half shillings to pounds. Or the escalator at Holborn Tube, is a tube station in London, is 156 feet long and makes the ascent in 65 seconds. Find the speed in miles per hour. Okay, so the pure math of it is something that everybody should agree on. Could not have been otherwise. But that's not to say that what these British people, I think what they're doing, I suspect what they're trying to do is, they've got this view that the British Empire will rule forever, and you're doing people a favor by giving them as much British culture along with their education as possible. So the more you can get them into your culture, you're doing them a favor because you, of course, are going to rule the world forever. So they're using math class as an opportunity to piggyback British culture into these people's lives, whether they like it or not. As a teacher, you try to use examples that people can relate to. That's the best strategy. You use examples that people can relate to give them access, the easiest access that they can to whatever it is you're talking about. This is pedagogically very weird. Okay, so this is quoted from an article by Bishop in 1990 called Western Math, a Secret Tool of Western Imperialism. I've put it on the Blackboard as an optional reading. I think it's interesting. And it's an example of the kind of arguments that were being made. So if you want a look at the kind of arguments that were being made for math as a social construct, this is more or less what it looked like. It's not a humongously important article. It got about 200 citations, 250 in that range. So it's more than anything I've ever written has been cited, but it's also not like a blockbuster paper that everybody cared about. But it's a nice example. It's fairly readable. You might feel that there's a bait and switch in the argument. So the way you phrase it, so you go Western math, tool of imperialism, makes it sound like it's the math itself that's the tool. But what he comes around to is things like what units are you using, what's your system of counting, and this stuff, like how do you phrase your word problems and stuff like this. He's not saying that it's the math, and furthermore, he comes at the end of the article to point out that calling it Western math is kind of a mistake, because the math that we have today is a global product. Like, the math, like zero didn't get produced in the Western world. The idea of zero didn't get produced in the Western world. Like, a whole bunch of calculation techniques were produced in India, China, the Islamic world. Like, the modern math is very much a global product, and then Westerners at the end of the Renaissance decided to just take credit for it and stop telling the story about where they stopped citing their sources, and we're just like, hey, look at what I made up, it's great. So believing that all math that we currently use is Western math is kind of just buying the propaganda of Renaissance Europeans. So I don't recommend you do that. Math, I take it, is a global achievement of all of the literate cultures that have been around. So if you look into the history of it, anyway. So check it out, it's somewhat interesting. I've also put a paper by Sandra Harding on there that I also found very interesting, where she's arguing for essentially what Longino and Granella are arguing, that if you take people's sort of social standpoint into account when considering their viewpoints, you actually produce a stronger form of objectivity. So if you want more objectivity, the thing to do is take people's social position into account when you're evaluating their argument. So anyway, those are optional. All right, and okay, so things that have been called social constructs. So gender, race, women refugees, child TV viewers, quarks, and these are social constructs in considerably different ways, right? So quarks and child TV viewers are a nice contrast, because child TV viewers, Hacking talks about this in the chapter, are a category that didn't exist before a certain period. So before a certain period, we just had TV viewers, and you tried to get the best ratings you could. And then after, marketers started identifying the child TV viewer as a specific category and marketing to them. And that affected the way people actually acted in the world. So this kind of feedback loop between our concepts and the world, right? So you literally create a category, that shapes people's behavior, and that behavior kind of reinforces the category. Because now there's kids' TV shows. There's TV shows specifically marketed to kids, and the kids respond to that, and then you have to market to them more specifically still. So the category is socially constructed in this really important and robust way, right? So child TV viewer, thinking of that as a category, actually changed the way both people who made TV and people who watched TV behaved. So that's a really strong sense of social construction. Compare that to quarks. Quarks do not care what we call them. They do not behave any differently if you call them one thing or another. They don't care what language you use. They don't care about anything. They're quarks. Quarks are going to behave the way they behave, and our categorization of them really isn't going to change that at all. So there's not this reciprocal relationship, right, between our categories and the quarks in the way that it was for child TV viewers. So calling quarks a social construct, as people have, is to say something very different than calling child TV viewers a social construct, or calling gender, race, or women refugees a social construct. There's much less scope with the quarks example. I think probably most people will agree, there's much less scope for the quarks example to be constructed in a way that changes the object being so-called constructed. Right? Now, it's conceptually possible that a different cultural configuration would have understood quarks differently. And it's conceptually possible that they would have come up with different physics than we currently have. I can't imagine that actually being the truth. But there's no conceptual problem there, is it? Like, it's not inconceivable, it's just unlikely as far as I can tell. Okay. So we've got these, Hacking lays out these 6 degrees of social construction. So 6 degrees to which you could be committed to the idea that something is socially constructed, and you'll see as we go through them, we're just going to go through them one by one, and you'll see that they have really different consequences for how we should think about the claim that something is a social construct. So really different consequences for what you're saying when you call something socially constructed. The historical, the ironic, the reformist, the unmasking, the rebellious, and the revolutionary. So increasingly strong claims as you move down the list. So let's just go through them. So to call something social construct in the historical sense is just to say that it's a product of a historical process. It's really hard to argue with this grade because everything that you can point to, name, categorize, or like even indicate to somebody else is done through a language or a culture or something that's a historical product, right? So there's historical reasons why I'm addressing you in English today. It didn't have to be that way. It could have been another language. But because of those social historical facts, that's the medium of communication here today. So really hard to argue with that, like, because everything is historically produced as far as anyone can tell. Our ideas about everything, like even totally neutral natural facts are understood because of some historical process. So this is the minimal sense in which literally everything that you can point to is in some sense socially constructed. And usually what you mean in this sense is our idea of the thing is socially constructed. So our idea of quarks is the result of a social process where we learn quantum mechanics and name these things and so on, right? But it doesn't really tell you that quarks aren't out there in the world, that we wouldn't get intersubjective agreement about them, and so on. So this is the weakest form of claiming something is socially constructed, and it doesn't really mean much, necessarily. It means that it could have been otherwise in at least some minimal sense. That's it. All right, and this, so I put up the Babylonian version of the Pythagorean theorem because, again, this is a result of a historical process that we learned the Pythagorean theorem. Our language for describing it could have been different, but as far as I can tell, I don't know any sense in which this could have been different, like the actual formal content of it could have been different. I'm unaware of such a thing. Okay, there's the ironic grade, one grade stronger. It says, X is a product of a historical process, but we're all stuck acting as though it's a permanent feature of reality, at least for now. And I would suggest that money's like this. So the system of money that we have now didn't need to exist exactly in the form that it exists now. So you can tell that by just looking at history, because we didn't used to have money. We used to operate on the barter system. After that, we had money that was based on the gold standard. So any piece of money represented a chunk of gold in some bank somewhere. That's no longer the case. We have a different way of basing the value of our money today. So it's been this historical social process that determines how money operates in the world today. And it's good to be aware of that, but it doesn't get you out of paying your bills, right? You can't walk away from a restaurant tab and go, well, money's just a social construct anyway. They'll chase you and yell at you. It'll be bad. So you can say, look, money's a social product in this ironic sense, but you still have to act as though it's an objective feature of reality, at least temporarily. You might dream of a day when they have the replicators from Star Trek, which is just like a box that you tell it what you want and it spits it out. And then in those under those circumstances, probably wouldn't have money as we understand it today, right? So money as it's currently socially constructed would probably evaporate and no longer be a concern if everybody could have anything that they wanted, just automatically, quickly, and easily, right? Because so post-scarcity would make the idea of money as we currently understand it probably irrelevant. But you still got to pay your rent. You still got to pay your tab at the bar. Okay. This grade is usually what people have in mind, I would suggest. This and the kind of the next couple of grades. Reformist. So X is bad, and although we can't think of a way to do without it entirely, we should make some changes to make it less bad. So I put up a picture of women's suffrage. So gender is one of those things that is strongly socially constructed. I would say socially constructed in a substantial and meaningful way. And again, you look at the history. You look at how it's changed over time to tell how it could have been different. For example, it used to be part of the understanding of gender that men get political power and women get none. That was just a natural, just like boys wear blue and girls wear pink, that struck people as just a completely natural feature of reality requiring no argument whatsoever. That's just the way it was. And because of a bunch of people's efforts, that's no longer the way that people think about it, at least in this part of the world. We no longer think that men should have all the political power and women should have zero, right? I hope you all agree to that. Nod. Yes. Okay, good. Right. So this was a reformist sense of social construction. Suffragists were not saying, let's demolish the difference between men and women. They weren't saying, let's give up on this as an idea. They were saying, what we need to do is change the way that we're constructing these categories. We need to change the associations with these two categories because the deal we've got now is terrible and it could be better. Right? So if you say something is socially constructed in the reformist sense, you're saying, first, number one, remember Hacking's 3 grades of this. So 1, it could have been otherwise. 2, it's bad the way it is. And 3, we should be changing it. So there's the reformist sense, once again, a stronger sense. There's the unmasking sense. So Hacking puts these two roughly on the same level because reformers and unmaskers are often the same people making the same argument. They just sort of have 2 projects going at the same time. So you try to reduce the authority of X by showing that it could have been otherwise. This is a really cognitively useful thing to do because you wander around the world with all kinds of, we were talking about the frame problem before, about how you experience the world through a set of frameworks that you intelligently ignore almost everything, right? So you're intelligently ignoring almost all the possibilities. You're just seeing the world through a given framework or a collection of frameworks. And that has the tendency to be very transparent. So you don't see the frame, usually, unless you're engaged specifically in a kind of critical project of asking, where did these categories come from? Why do we have them? Why are they the way they are? And so unmaskers, often by citing history, often by citing the possibilities for the future, try to reduce the assumed authority of a way of seeing by pointing out that it's socially constructed. Right? And my favorite example of this is the blue, again, blue is for boys, pink is for girls, because if you don't reflect on that, you'll see right through it. Right? You don't see that this is a category that's been laid out, a way of understanding these categories has been laid on the world as a product of a social process. You just see it's just a natural fact about the universe. So one of the useful things that you can do by critiquing things as social constructs is bring the frame into explicit view. Right? Instead of seeing through a frame, you see the frame itself, and then you can ask questions about it at least. And that's why unmasking and reforming go really nicely together. So the first step in reform is to point out, hey, did you ever think maybe women could vote? Oh, okay. Now we can ask, is that a good idea or isn't it? Right? So you've taken something that was just a natural fact, which you see through, and you brought it into explicit focus as a frame that could be critiqued, and then the possibility of reforming it appears. Right? Okay, a couple more grades. The rebellious level. So the rebellious person believes all 3 of these strongly. So these are, again, Hacking's 3 grades. So it need not have existed. So X is contingent, X is quite bad, and we would be much better off if X were done away with or at least radically transformed. So warning, reflections in this mirror may be distorted by socially constructed ideas of beauty. So a rebellious person with respect to beauty standards are another thing that are just obviously socially constructed, and you can tell that by looking at the history of beauty standards across the world. There's a whole bunch of different ones. The ones we have today are not in any sense, well, I don't want to say they're not in any sense universal. Most, many, or perhaps all cultures like things like facial symmetry. Like that's a thing that, I don't know of any culture that doesn't like facial symmetry. So maybe that's a universal beauty standard. But things like, girls get long hair and boys get short hair. That's one that really isn't a necessary feature of reality. And we might be better off if the standards that we have were either done away with or radically transformed. Okay? And then the last one is the revolutionary. Basically, it's the same as the rebellious phase. So you can be in the rebellious phase but not actually have a concrete social plan for how to change it. The revolutionary one is where you not only identify that it's socially, it could have been otherwise, it's bad, and we'd be better off, but that you actually have a plan for how to go about changing it. So the monarchy is a social construct that the French decided that they didn't need anymore, and actually they'd be better off without it. So again, it's one of those things that if your family's been living under monarchy for like a couple of millennia, it might come to be a natural assumption to you that there are just noble people and peasants, and that everybody's in their proper place, and that's just how it is, right? That framework can come to be transparent to you. And the French Revolution was an instance of people saying, no, this should not be a transparent framework. This should not be something that we just accept. And furthermore, we're not just going to socially critique it. We're going to get out the hatchets and the guillotine, and we're going to do something about it. So that's the strongest grade of social, like calling something a social construct. And furthermore, we're going to go out in the streets and change it. So that's the strongest version for hacking. Okay, so that's his 6 grades of social construction, going from, I don't want to say the historical one is trivial. It's interesting and important from a kind of abstract point of view. But as you go down and down, you're getting more and more serious about how much you think the thing needs to be called contingent, like that it needs to be said contingent is just, it could have been otherwise. So how much does it need to be pointed out that it's contingent? And what does that say for the way we act? So as you go lower and lower on the scale, you're saying, we need to do either conceptual reformation or literal, like changing the way society is structured kind of thing. Okay, so the point here is that it matters a lot, both exactly what you're saying is socially constructed and what degree you're on this scale, right? It matters a lot to the sensibleness of your claim. So if somebody says math is socially constructed, you say, okay. Which part of math? Do you mean just the pure formal structure, or do you mean the whole educational apparatus that goes around with it? And once you've got a clear answer to that, then you can ask, okay, so where are you on this scale? When you're calling it socially constructed, what do you really recommend? Like, what normative claim are you making about how we should act in response to that fact? And so it's real easy to prove the historical one, right? That's easy to establish, but it doesn't mean much in terms of how we should act. It's much harder to establish the lower down ones, but they mean a lot more in terms of the normative consequences of the thing. So it may be the case that we should change something about our society because something is a bad social construct. Okay? I think having this framework in mind is enough for you to sort through practically any claim that something is socially constructed and see what the real content of the claim is. Sometimes people will offer you an argument for one of the easier to establish ones and then act as though what they've given you is a rebellious or revolutionary, an argument for being rebellious or revolutionary. So this is kind of like bait and switch thing where, you know, is it the case? So yes, it's the case that science is the product of a historical process. Absolutely. Could it be that it could have been otherwise in important and interesting ways? Yeah, some parts of it, undoubtedly, right? Is it the case that we should throw out science and start again from scratch because it's a tool of Western imperialism? Harder to establish that, isn't it? Harder to establish that case. And the strength of your argument is going to depend on where you're trying to land on this scale. Yeah? Okay. So hopefully that helps clarify in what senses are these important or interesting claims? In what senses are these claims that can be established with what kind of evidence? Right. So, and contingency is the absolute key of this, which is kind of unfortunate in some senses. So it's great to have contingency as your mark of something being socially constructed in cases where you've got a nice historical record. So the pink is for girls, blue is for boy thing. We have a nice historical record of like it actually was a different way not that long ago in a very similar cultural construct or context, right? So the fact that it could have been otherwise is very clearly established by the evidence. When you're asking about the large-scale structure of science, contingency is a lot harder to establish, I would argue, because we've only seen it happen once on this planet. Anything that's only happened once on Earth it's really hard to say whether it could have been otherwise or not. So if the Western world had been wiped out by a meteor strike and China was the ones who developed modern science, would they have come up with the same science as the Western world did or not? We don't know the answer to that. We have no evidence about that, I would argue. So this is, if you played Civilization or any other game like this, I think Civilization is part of one of the really, it's a fantastic game, but it gives us a really misleading picture of how the history of science and technology work, right? This is a tech tree where your civilization starts off with agriculture, and then maybe you get mining and archery and animal husbandry, and mining unlocks masonry and bronze working. Now, this is a non-contingent picture of history, right? So, I mean, what's contingent is, if do you research the wheel first or do you research masonry first? But on this way of understanding how like a civilization moves through the stages of history, there's only one way it could have gone on the whole. Right? So no matter where you start out in the game of civilization, you're going to go through pretty much exactly the same process of technological scientific development until you get nukes and destroy all your enemies. Right? That's how these games picture the structure of history. Now the question is that an accurate picture of history, or is it not? Maybe, so, and this is a question that we probably can't answer from our current knowledge situation. The thing that would answer it would be to discover aliens. It would be to become part of a galactic community where we can see a lot of different histories of science, right? So, people from Alpha Centauri, how did your science go? Where did you start? Where did that lead you? And where did you end up? And if their story is just exactly the same as ours, and the star next to them was the same as ours, and the star next to them was the same as ours, then it's non-contingent. It's like a tech tree, right? That would be the evidence that you would need to tell us that science could not have gone any other way. That would be evidence, by the way, that you shouldn't connect Western culture with science, because it didn't matter who came up with these ideas. Somebody would have. Just like the Pythagorean theorem, if any culture, given enough time and resources, would have come up with quantum mechanics as we understand it today, then quantum mechanics is non-contingent in those ways. Right? And the thing that we'd need to know is either how would it have gone again if we ran history again from the beginning? Would it have gone differently? It's an unlikely thing to find out about. But if a million years from now we talk to a whole bunch of different alien civilizations and they tell us, oh no, yeah, we went through the same, we did something that looks just like your Newtonian mechanics, and then we did something that looks like just like your quantum mechanics, and then just like your string theory. Like if they go through all the same steps as us, then that means that all of the kind of cultural trappings that go along with science didn't really matter that much. Like it mattered to the people involved who was holding the gun and who the gun was pointed at, of course. But in terms of the structure of the knowledge that was generated, the history part didn't really matter. Now compare that to a scenario where we get to talk to a whole bunch of alien civilizations and they all had radically different stories. Right? They started from different places, they went through different stages, and they ended up in different places. That would mean that the specifics of our historical development did matter. Right? That would be a case for contingency in the history of science, and therefore a really good collection of evidence for the idea that the social dimension had a really determinative influence. Now again, it's worth noting what we can or cannot imagine in this scenario. So I cannot imagine a different periodic table, really. Like maybe different ways of drawing the lines, but I just cannot imagine if a different culture had gotten to the stage of building the periodic table first that they would have come up with really interestingly or importantly different results. But I wouldn't be able to imagine that, would I? Because I'm stuck in this history that we have, in this conceptual scheme that we have. There's some limits to my ability to question my own frameworks, right? So your framework is given to you by your culture, and at some point, at some rock bottom, you're unable to step outside of it and critique it from outside. This is why I'm telling you this story about aliens, because that would genuinely give us a way of stepping outside of our own history, of our own culture, and asking serious questions about it. So that's what I would say it depends on. Again, it's not a question that we have any way of We have similar questions about evolutionary history, by the way. So the question is, could evolution have gone differently? And again, we really just don't know because we've only seen it happen once. So that's what the question is, the large scale, not just like what language did you put it in or who got the Nobel Prize, but like what were the actual results of the scientific process and what will they be into the future? That's what it depends on. Like, would it have been profoundly different if you started over again and ran the thing again? So it may seem that anything which is a scientific fact could not be otherwise. Like, that's what makes it a scientific fact, is that it's a non-contingent feature of our world. But I hope to have shown you in lecture 4, where we talked about discovery and the frame problem, that we can bring many different perspectives to bear on any given issue. So it could be that given a framework, you couldn't have come up with a different result, but that there were possibly multiple different frameworks that you could have brought to bear. So just to round this out, I want to give you kind of a perspective. This guy is Rasmus Winther, and he argues for what I really like as a general position on this. So I've given you a framework for thinking about different ways of thinking about different parts of science, but I want to give you kind of a general framework to think about this broader issue. He argues for what's called contextual objectivity. And in short, this means that there are many ways of drawing a map of reality, but once you've chosen a way, then you can be right or wrong. So the choice of your way of mapping reality is often a value-laden question. So like, what's important to you determines the framework, but given a framework, so that's the contextual part, but given a framework, now you can ask questions about which you can be genuinely right or wrong. It's not just whatever you think. You can be wrong about your answers within a framework. So he's got this really nice map metaphor that I quite like. So this is the good old-fashioned Mercator projection. This is the standard, probably the standard way of mapping the world. And this map is a way of reducing information. So you've got a globe that's three-dimensional, and you need to reduce that 3D information onto a two-dimensional plane. And there are choices about how you filter that, how you reduce, how you compress the information. This is one of them. This is the standard one that most people have seen most of the time. And it's got a really nice feature that if you're trying to sail a boat, then what's a straight line for your boat is a straight line on this map. It's really nice, a really helpful feature. Now they get that feature by sacrificing something else, that is the landmass. So this is a very inaccurate map of how big the different continents are. So for example, this has North America and Africa look about the same size, and Greenland is way, way bigger than Australia. Right? So here's a different projection called the Berman projection. In the Berman projection, what's conserved is land mass. So the overall size of the continents on the 3D plane is preserved on this 2D plane, but you can no longer draw straight lines for where your boat's going to go. So notice about this, Greenland is now way, way smaller than Australia. Yeah? And Africa is way, way bigger than North America. So in terms of actual landmass, this is much more accurate. Right? This represents it clearly, how big the different continents are. Yeah? Now, which one is the true representation of the Earth? Neither of them are true. That's not a question that you can ask about a framework. Frameworks are not, only two things in the universe can be true or false: statements or beliefs. Those are the only kinds of things that are eligible for truth or falsity. Frameworks are not. Similarly, the English language. Is the English language true or false? No, is the answer to that. No, it's not true or false. It's a set of categories, ways of speaking, and relatedly ways of thinking that can be appropriate or inappropriate, good or bad in a context. It's not even eligible to be true or false. Similarly, these projections are not eligible to be true or false. However, once you've chosen a projection, now you can make correct or incorrect uses of it. So if you say, okay, I'm going to accept the Berman projection, and then you draw Greenland bigger than Australia, you've made a mistake. You've made an error. Right? So given a projection, now we can say whether you did it right or not. The projection itself is something that you can just say, well, I like the Mercator projection. I'm sailing a boat. I want the Mercator projection. I'm trying to figure out how big continents are. I want the Berman projection. So that your values, your goals, your interests determine which one is the appropriate framework to adopt. Once you've adopted a framework, now there are correct and incorrect answers about whether you've used it right. Another nice set of examples are maps. So this is Winther's favorite. So here's a map of the TTC. This is in some sense a map of Toronto. They've sacrificed things like how far away, like there's no sense in which the distance between these dots represent the actual distance between the stations, right? Because if you're on a subway, the whole thing about a subway is that it reduces the relevance of how far away things are. That's the whole point of a subway, is that it makes it less important, the distance. So what matters is the order if you're on the subway. The order is crucially important. You need to know that if you're trying to get off at St. Andrew and you're going south, go St. Patrick, Osgood, St. Andrew. As the order matters, so that's what gets represented. That's what's part of this framework. Distance matters less, so they fudge the distance. Right? They stop trying to care about it. So if your goal is to ride the subway somewhere, this is the appropriate way of mapping the system. And compare that to if you're riding a bike. So here's the Toronto bicycle system map. Now we've got quite different sets of goals, interests, and desires that prescribe a different framework. So now distance does matter. If you're on a bike, the distance does matter. Furthermore, things like where is there traffic and where is there not, like where's a good place to ride a bike, is quite different than how do I use the subway. Right? So a bicycle map picks out different features as relevant, worth representing, and then the subway map, right? Now, which is the correct map of Toronto? There's not an answer to that. A way of mapping is not eligible to be true or false. It's eligible to be good, useful, important, valuable, right? So maybe our concepts are like this, are like a set of maps where the concepts that you bring to bear in the world are like a way of mapping the world. It's a way of reducing the information that you have to deal with. So you can't represent every feature of Toronto on a map. That would be a useless map. Right? Because what you need a map to do is reduce the information that you have to deal with and present you with only the important information. Now, which information is important? Well, that depends on what you're trying to do, doesn't it? Right? It depends on your values. So the choice between frames is not a choice between true and false. The choice between frames is a value judgment about what's interesting, important, or relevant. But once you have a framework, now you can be right or wrong. It's not just whatever your opinion is good. The fact is that if you represent Dundas West as being out east here, you've made an error within this mapping structure, right? So this is contextual objectivity. This is Winther's basic answer to this whole relativism versus realism debate. He says, look, the way you draw your map is value relative. Which features to include and which features to exclude has to be answered relative to a set of goals, interests, and values. But having chosen a type of map, there is a real fact of the matter about whether you got it right or not. Okay, so that's if you want a general answer to like, which is true, relativism or realism, I would recommend this, which is it's supposed to be a middle ground between the two, where say we split the question into two. Are we talking about your way of representing, or are we talking about the representations within a way of representing? Okay. All right, well, so that's more or less the first half of this course. So that's the question of, can values influence science? And then after the midterm, we'll do the opposite. We'll switch into the opposite mode and start talking about the potential impact of science on values. There'll be a little bit of values on science as well, so we're going to kind of do the whole loop a little bit, but that was the sort of first half. Quick questions before we go? Okay, great. We'll see you all bright and early Wednesday morning at the exam center.